right, so thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We have Diane Wilson here for the first event in our Minnesota Writers Series, right in our midst. Today's program is funded with money from Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. These funds are often referred to as legacy funds and are distributed to Washington County Library by MELSA, which is an alliance of metro area public libraries. I'm Christina De Sabrino. I'm a librarian at Washington County Library, and we're so pleased to welcome Diane this evening. She is the author of numerous books. I've shared most of her recent ones on the screen here. Her most recent book is an anthology of Native women writers, which she is the editor of. It's Voices Rising. She's very well known for her recent novel, The Seed Keeper. And she's received numerous awards, a 2013 Bush Foundation Fellowship, awards from the Minnesota State Arts Board, the Jerome Foundation, and the East Central Regional Arts Council. In 2018, she received a 50/50 award from Pollen Midwest. She also received a Minnesota Book Award, and her memoir, Spirit Car, was selected for the One Minneapolis, One Read program. She's also the executive director for the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, a national organization supporting sovereign food systems for Native peoples. So with that, I'd like to welcome Diane. Thank you.
Amatakiapi. Hello, all my relatives. My name's Diane Wilson. I am a Bidewakantwan Oyate descendant, and I'm enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation. And I really want to thank Christina for hosting tonight's event, and to all of you for coming back onto Zoom and spending some of your evening together. You know, it's just such a great thing for us as writers, after working in solitude all those years writing these books, to actually have conversation with people. So I really appreciate your time tonight. And so what I'm planning to do is to talk about writing The Seed Keeper and why that story, this book, is so important to me. And then I'll read a couple of brief excerpts, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. And I really hope that as I'm talking and reading, that you're coming up with questions, because as I said, this is my opportunity to get to have a conversation with people who are interested in this book. And I just, I really enjoy it. So please feel free to ask anything that you would like to know. So, I also appreciate that bio, Christina. And what I would add to that about what I do is I'm a gardener and a writer. And those were the 4 books that I've published so far. And I am, right now, I'm the former executive director for Native American Food Sovereignty. I just retired a couple months ago. So, you know, I still have to get the website updated. You know, my bad. So I'm a former executive director for 2 Native organizations doing food sovereignty work in Native communities. And so in writing this book, all of this experience, being a gardener, writing books, and serving for Native organizations, all went into writing it. So it's like a big stew pot. So the way that I even got started writing The Seed Keeper, people always ask, well, how long did it take you? And it's kind of hard to pinpoint when things start. But I would say that it took me 10 years to write the book, but it actually took me 20 years to learn what I needed to know in order to write it. So 20 years ago, I was working on a memoir, that Spirit Car, that was my first book. I had grown up in Minneapolis, and I knew that my mother was Dakotah. She was enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation, and my dad was Swedish descent, and I had 4 siblings. But my mother, I knew that she had attended the Holy Rosary Mission School on the Pine Ridge Reservation for 6 years, and her older sisters went to the St. Francis Mission School on the Rosebud Reservation. But my mother really didn't like to talk about it. She just would say, we were poor and I'm done with all that. So she raised us we were not connected to our Native community. So this left me with a lot of questions as I grew up. And then when I became an adult, I wrote a memoir about 5 generations in my mother's family that shows how assimilation works across generations. And that was then published in 2006. But while I was working on the memoir, I heard about this little garden down in Farmington, which is south of the Twin Cities. And they were growing out these just incredible, old, rare indigenous seeds that had been grown and saved by Native families for many generations. And, as a gardener, when I heard about those seeds, I just thought, well, I've got to go be part of that. I need to work with those seeds. So in a sense, when I think back on that, I almost feel as if those seeds were calling me to come be part of that work, because they have certainly shaped the past 20 years of my life in terms of the writing that I do and also the work that I ended up doing. And what I didn't know at that time when I was volunteering is that those seeds we were working with were nearly extinct, that there were only a handful of each variety of seeds left as far as we knew. So I continued to volunteer for a few years. And then in 2008, by that time, this little garden, which is called Dream of Wild Health, had purchased a 10-acre farm in Hugo. And then I was hired on as the executive director and worked there for the next 11 years. And to me, that's when my real education began. Unlike what I had learned growing up in white schools about our relationship to the earth, I was working with elders like Ernie Whiteman and with farmers and with Native youth who would come up from the day and with the seeds themselves. And so every morning before we went into the garden, we used to gather in a circle and we would pray and we would offer tobacco, which is considered to be a sacred medicine by many Native communities. We would offer that as a gift in gratitude for the gifts that we were about to receive from the plants. And so what we were learning was to go into the garden and to approach gardening and working with plants from a place of reverence, so that understanding that those seeds were our relatives, that they're our ancestors, and that they are actually sacred beings. And this is a very different kind of relationship with gardening than anything I had experienced to that point. And there is a saying in Dakota, Mitakuye Owasi, which means we are all related. And so the way that farm was run was to treat all of the plants and the soil and the water and everything around us as a relative. And if you treat everything as a relative, then you take care of them as if they were somebody very important to you. And then in exchange, they take care of you. And this is the principle of reciprocity, which has so much to do with the way that traditional gardening has always been taken care of in Native families. And so when we garden that way with that, from that place of reverence, then our belief is that then your food really becomes medicine for your body. It's grown in healthy soil, it's tended with love, and then it really nurtures both your spirit and your body. And while I was working there, I also learned more of the hard history around tribes' experience. And, there was some amazing history as well about I learned that 3/5 of the foods that we rely on today were developed by indigenous gardeners in the Americas. So imagine the corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, tobacco, chocolate, all these amazing foods were developed many, many years ago by indigenous gardeners. But, and here in the Midwest, my people, the Dakota, and also the Ojibwe, our traditional diets came from hunting and gathering wild plants and also gardening. And then when tribes were moved onto the reservations in the late 1800s and early 1900s, then they lost access to these traditional foods. And the government instead provided commodity foods, which are high in starch and fat. And within a generation or two, you really saw the health of these communities begin to suffer. So that today, in much of the work that I've been doing with Native organizations, we're trying to combat the epidemic level of type 2 diabetes in Native communities. And so what I see is that is a result of what happened when Native communities left their traditional diets. So all of this was, all that I was learning was part of what was going into these early drafts of the novel that I started working on when I was at Dream of Wild Health. And so for me, writing this book is very much a way to give back to the people who were so generous in sharing their knowledge and their skills and their understanding with me, so that, you know, I was able to really learn so much more about gardening and about actually about my own culture. And so to put that understanding in a story is what I do as a writer, because that's one of the ways in which we can share our history, and that we make sure through those stories we can share them with broader communities, and we can also pass that knowledge on to future generations. So, I have to say, it's definitely been a labor of love. And at the heart of The Seed Keeper it was actually inspired by a true story that I first heard back in 2002. And I was participating in the Dakota Commemorative March, which was to honor the 1,700 Dakota women, children, and elders who were removed from Minnesota after the 1862 Dakota War. And because they had no idea where they were being sent or how they would feed their families, the women sewed their seeds into the hems of their skirts and hid them in their pockets. So while they're on this very long walk, 150 miles from the Lower Sioux to Fort Snelling, and even when families were starving, these women protected their seeds for the coming season, but also for future generations. And so it's thanks to their courage and sacrifice that we actually have that Dakota corn still today. And I grow it in my own garden, so that it's a way for me to continue to support that corn, but also to remember just how important that history was. So the story is told through the voices of 4 Dakota women across several generations, from 1862 to 2002. And the seeds themselves open the book with a poem that reminds us of the original agreement to take care of them in exchange for food. And this is, when I say original agreement, this is something that is often talked about in Native communities as that agreement with seeds, plants, animals, that if we take care of them, they take care of us. So you could say, in a sense, that our survival depends on that relationship with everything around us. And so the main character is Rosalie Iron Wing, and she's a young Dakota woman whose family has really come to the furthest edge of assimilation, in the sense that she has pretty much lost everything. She has no connection to her community or her family or her language. And so this book is very much about Rosalie's journey to rediscover who she is and just and find a place for herself in the world. So the story begins as Rosalie is about to leave the farm where she's lived for 22 years, and she's going to return to her childhood home on a Dakota reservation. And after her father died when she was 12, she grew up in foster care, believing that she had no family. So, and at that time, Rosalie had no connection at all to seeds. But when she marries a white farmer and learns to garden, that's when she starts the journey that ultimately brings her back to her family and their legacy of seeds and also her community. So I would like to read you an excerpt that is from the beginning of the book. And this is just as Rosalie is getting ready to leave the farm. Her husband has recently passed away, and she is preparing to go back home for the first time in 22 years. So this is set in 2002. For the past 22 years, I have lived on a farm that once belonged to the prairie. Every summer, I looked out my kitchen window at long rows of corn planted all the way to the oak trees that grow along the river. Even today, after a winter storm had covered the field, I could see dried corn stalks stubbling the fresh white blanket of snow. From the radio on the counter behind me, the announcer read the daily hog report in his flat Midwestern voice. His words meant nothing. They were empty noise, pushing back the silence that had taken over my house. After a breakfast of toast and coffee, I closed the curtains on the window, feeling how thin the cotton had become from too many years in the sun. I stacked clean dishes in the cupboard and wiped down the counters. Routine tasks, comforting in their simplicity. No need to think, to plan, to remember. Just keep moving. I poured the rest of the milk down the drain and straightened a stack of papers on the table. After writing a brief note for my son, I locked the door behind me. A fierce gust of wind tore at my scarf, stung my face with a handful of snow. I walked past the empty barn, half expecting to see our old hound come around the corner, eyelids drooping, sway-backed, his slow-moving trot showing the chickens who was boss. Gone now, all of them. My heavy boots squeaked on the snow that had drifted back across the sidewalk I had shoveled earlier that morning. When I called Roger Peterson to tell him he did not need to plow the driveway, he asked how long I would be gone. I hesitated, how to answer a question that would most likely get shared with my neighbors. For a few days, I said, I'll call you when I'm back. He paused, and I knew what was coming next. Before he could shape his condolences into a few awkward phrases, I said a quick goodbye and hung up without waiting for an answer. I had left John's truck running for about 20 minutes, long enough for the heater to blast a melted hole in the ice that covered the windshield. After tossing my duffel bag onto the seat next to me, I eased the truck into gear, babying the clutch. Near bald rear tires spun slightly before finding gravel beneath the snow. As I drove past the orchard, I ignored the branches that were in need of pruning. While my father believed that any plant not grown in the wild was nothing more than a weak cousin to its truer self, my years of caring for these trees had taught me differently. But it was just as well that he hadn't lived long enough to see me marry a descendant of the German immigrants that he ranted against for stealing Dakota land. When I'd woken that morning, I knew I needed to leave now before I changed my mind. At the end of our long driveway, I decided against stopping for a last look at the fields behind me. Without slowing down, I turned the truck east as if heading to town, the rear end sliding sideways. I waved at Charlie Ingebrigtsen, the farmer who'd bought George and Judith's farm for a steal at auction. He stared after me as I passed by, hanging on to his mailbox as my truck whipped up a white cloud of snow around him. I never did care for my neighbors knowing my business, not today. For the first few miles, I drove fast, both hands gripping the wheel as each rut in the gravel road sent a hard shock through my body. I drove as if pursued, as if hunted by all that I was leaving behind. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the woman I saw was a stranger, 40 years old, her dark hair streaked with a few strands of gray, eyes wide like a frightened mouse, her mouth a thin, determined line, sharp as an arrow. Not terrible looking, Gabby would have said, except for the black framed glasses, the same kind I wore as a girl, a safety pin holding today's pair together. Beneath my puffy coat, I was wearing a flannel shirt, baggy jeans, and long underwear. An Indian farmer, the government's dream come true. So throughout the book, the story actually moves around in time and it alternates between the main character, Rosalie Iron Wing, and then the voices of her best friend, Gabby Makepeace, who overcomes a difficult childhood to become a lawyer and an activist on behalf of the river. We also hear from her great aunt, Darlene Kilsdeer, who actually has spent much of her life searching for Rosalie. And we hear from Marie Blackbird, who is Rosalie's great-great-grandmother, who was 14 during the 1862 Dakota War. And it's Marie that actually carries much of the harder history of the story, starting with the 1862 Dakota War, and then the removal that followed, and then also the impact of boarding schools on her family. And then as we're following the lives of these women, we're also following the story of the seeds until one day they disappear. So I'm going to read one more short excerpt. And this is when Rosalie is meeting her great aunt, Darlene Kilsdeer, for the first time, after believing for many years that she had no family. And I actually tell you this right up front in the prologue of the book so that you know, although for much of the story, Rosalie believes she doesn't have any family, you'll know as the reader. So this isn't a spoiler. Just wanted you to know that. So this is Rosalie going to visit for the very first time her only remaining relative, and she's bringing with her her son, Thomas, and this is set in 2002 in Mankato. Darlene Kilsdeer had just finished lunch when her nurse invited us into the apartment. Darlene's voice had sounded so frail on the phone that I was not sure what to expect. My throat was tight and my eyes burned with fatigue. I felt oddly numb. I couldn't wait to get this over with. Already, I regretted bringing Thomas with me. As I waited for the nurse to hang up our coats, I looked around at the faded carpet, the scuff marks on dingy white walls. Darlene's third-floor window looked out at an elementary school. The apartment was less than 10 miles from where I had once lived, on the other side of town. The living room was small, with the television in one corner and two mismatched chairs for guests. A few steps into the room, I stopped abruptly, stunned by the sight of tall corn stalks growing in buckets and cans set on yellowed newspapers, their edges curled and stained with mud. The floor was littered with brown leaves. From the curtain rod hung a dozen ears of blue and rose-speckled corn, neatly braided. On the ledge outside the window, I could see bits of bread and apple. As the nurse quietly stacked a tray with dishes, she nodded toward the two chairs. I moved a pile of folded laundry to the floor and sat down, Thomas next to me. Darlene was leaning back in a recliner with her eyes closed. An oxygen tank stood on the floor near her chair. A thin cloud of dark hair, streaked heavily with gray, fell around her shoulders, framing her thin face, her skin translucent yellow. I knew her high cheekbones, the sharp ridge of her nose. Bony hands rested on the blanket that covered her lap, the two thin mounds of her legs. I set the damp package of nettles that I had gathered that morning on the table near Darlene's chair. As we waited for Darlene to open her eyes, we listened to the low murmur from the television as Bob Barker announced a new winner on The Price is Right. Thomas straightened the collar of his shirt and sat jiggling one foot, unable to keep still. A plaque on the shelf above the television named Darlene Kilsdeer as Miss Indian Princess for 1939. A birch bark basket held a long braid of sweetgrass. Inside a dusty frame was a photo of a child standing next to a much younger Darlene. They were posing in front of the cabin. The child was me. When I turned back, Darlene was awake. We studied each other. "It is you," she said. "You have your mother's eyes." When I introduced Thomas, he stood and extended his hand to her. She looked up at him and frowned. Turning to me, she said, "Rosalie, why is your son in such a hurry?" An awkward silence fell in the room. Then I felt a soft touch on my arm. Darlene leaned forward and patted my hand. "You did the best you could," she said. "You had no mother to learn from. Your father passed too soon, and they took you before any of us knew what had happened. That's how it was back then. They could just come and take your children. That's why." Darlene began to cough, raising a white handkerchief to her lips. The nurse came in with a glass of water and a pill. We waited while Darlene took her medicine. "That's why I had to plant this corn," she continued with a weak smile. "That's how I found you. Plants have their own way of talking. It's not the same here as in the garden, but it was something I could do. I could ask the plants for their help. I could ask the crow for his help. I could talk to the oak trees on the boulevard outside my apartment and ask them to watch for you. You must have been 12 when they took you. I pounded on desks and filled out paperwork and walked, just hoping I would catch sight of you somewhere. Every time I walked past a school, I would stop and look at all the little girls running on the playground. Every time I climbed on a bus, I looked in the face of each child. I dreamed you at night, living somewhere behind a metal fence, your face always turned toward the door. Year after year, we've kept this vigil. I promised to wait for you until my last breath, and now you're here. So the question that I ask throughout the book is about our relationship with seeds and how that relationship has changed over many generations, and what that change means not only for us as human beings, but also for the seeds themselves. And the other part of that question comes from a quote by a Dakota activist and scholar, Harley Eagle, who says, "How do we fall back in love with the earth? How do we fall back in love with our seeds?" And I'm going to close with a single paragraph that just talks about seeds and pretty much sums up how I see the role of seeds in the world. "Everywhere I looked, I saw how seeds were holding the world together. They planted forests, covered meadows with wildflowers, sprouted in the cracks of sidewalks, or lay dormant until the long-awaited moment came, signaled by fire or rain or warmth. They filled the produce aisle in grocery stores. Seeds breathed and spoke in a language all their own. Each one was a miniature time capsule, capturing years of stories in its tender flesh. How ignorant I felt compared to the brilliance contained in a single seed. I had begun to see that when we save these seeds, when we select which ones will be planted again, our lives become braided into the life stories of these plants. And that's where I'm going to close tonight and then open it up to questions and comments and conversation.
So Sue Swanson said in the chat, she asked if you could tell us about your beautiful seed jewelry.
My beautiful seed jewelry is that, let's see, what, and can you tell me, Sue, what are you looking at?
Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, it would be great.
I will unmute. I saw your jewelry at White Bear Center for the Arts.
Oh, you know, I don't actually make jewelry, so that must have been somebody else.
Oh, that was inspired by your book.
Oh, oh, that's fantastic. I don't know if you guys, I don't know who's read this. So this is actually the cover of the book. And this is, this was commissioned. This is an actual beadwork created by Holly Young, who is a bead artist out in South Dakota. And it's just like the most beautiful artwork. Some of the most beautiful beadwork I've ever seen. But Sue, that's so wonderful to know that it was jewelry. I haven't actually seen it.
Oh, they do have it in the gift shop of actual jewelry made of seeds that was inspired by your book, and it's beautiful.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for sharing about that.
You.
Can
I ask another question?
Sure. Yeah, and then we'll get to the other one. Go ahead.
How did you get reconnected with your people on Rosebud yourself?
Writing the memoir, when I did that, I did a lot of research for it. And I also went back and traveled out to South Dakota numerous times. I went back to, I actually went with my mother and visited the Holy Rosary Mission School on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And we also went to St. Francis. So I went and visited all the places that I learned about. And, you know, so tried to learn just as much as I could about my family's history. And then we just made sure that our family continues to be enrolled out there.
I have a question, Diane.
Yeah.
First of all, oh, my cat. Sorry, then my picture went off here. I've really enjoyed your book. I'm just at the end of it right now because I've been savoring it. I think you do such a nice job of bringing the reader into the world of like Rosalie and whoever. It's like you're seeing right through their own eyes. And I guess I was curious if any aspects of the book have a connection to your family or your family experience.
You know, I have to say that the character of Rosalie, I kind of see a fair amount of my mother in her.
Okay. And
then in fact, all of the characters, and I would guess this is common for a lot of writers, but they're composites. So it really helps me when I'm first developing a character to think about somebody I know. So it could be a family member, it could be a friend. And then I have an image in mind and what that person is like. And then I can kind of build around that and modify it and alter it. But it's really helpful to have that image. So I would say that the book isn't directly connected to my life, but it's certainly, I tried to infuse it with what I learned in my life, both from writing the memoir and understanding, how assimilation works, and then all of the experiences that I had in these different organizations. And then it's kind of fun to just throw in little, you have a little fun with it. So there's a Emma Lou's Cafe, that they stop at. Well, Emma Lou was my dog's name. So, you just, it's fun to put little things like that. And the character Judith, I actually have a neighbor, Judith. She's passed on since, but she was, that character was definitely inspired by the Judith who lived down the road from me. And so there's all kinds of ways in which your own life sort of gets woven in, but not. So yeah, good question. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you.
Catherine had a question in the chat. She said, I love the stories you tell. Can you talk about how fiction moves us in ways that memoir or nonfiction does not?
That's something that I think about a lot. What I really loved about it, so writing fiction was a big learning curve because I had written creative nonfiction and nonfiction. And so I thought, oh, this is going to be so fun and easy because you get to make stuff up. And then I realized when you're writing it, you have to make up everything. It's like you have to create the entire world because in a memoir, I have my family story. I'm, shaping it into a book and adding all kinds of, my own observations to it, but I have the story, I have the characters, I have the places. And then when you write fiction, you've got to make choices for everything. And so that was a big learning curve. Developing characters was another learning curve. But what I loved about it was that I could then tell a story about these seeds that would bring out what I was trying to get at around relationship. Because to me, that's probably the most important theme of the book, is that relationship that we have had with seeds as human beings. And this is everybody. I mean, I'm thinking, the reason why Rosalie first starts to garden with John's mother's seeds is to show that overlap, to show the way that farmers have cared for their soil, cared for their seeds, cared for their animals, and always took and knew how important it was to rotate crops and nurture your soil. And so I wanted to show that this is work that we all share, and that when we are in that good relationship with the earth, then we all benefit. So writing in fiction gave me the freedom to shape the story in a way that could carry that theme and those teachings. But yeah, it was, and then you can also do a lot more with the language. And that was really, really gratifying to be able to explore language.
Barb, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple comments. I'm a big Ken Kruger fan. I've read his things. I also like to read Hillerman, Tony, and his daughters. And I just finished Road Back to Sweet, whatever it was.
Oh, Linda Lagarde Grover. No, yeah, Linda Lagarde Grover.
Yes. Yeah. And what I find so uplifting in all those is the relationship that the Native Americans have with the earth, with each other, where, everybody is aunts and uncles, and I think, it takes a village and all that stuff. But I think that is a very important part of our culture that we don't necessarily embrace it as much as we should. And I've also used part of your spirit car for some a program we had for Washington County. I'm retired from Washington County now for a little over a year. Mm-hmm. And we did a program where we went out and read to residents in nursing homes. And that was one of my favorite to use because of the, you didn't know this about your mother. And mm-hmm. I think a lot of us could say that about our family. We don't.
I agree.
Until mm-hmm. it's too late,
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff from my family that my oldest son is trying to get through ancestry stuff, because my mom and dad had some of it, but not enough. But I just think that Native American respect for the earth and the way they're explaining the way that things came into being and stuff is just such a beautiful story and connection with the earth.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah. And I also, the part about knowing your own family history, so I think that's critically important for all of us to really know who you are and then make sure that those stories get passed on. Yeah, and thank you for telling me about Spirit Car. That's fun to hear.
Diane, this is Jim Redfield from Forest Lake. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the farm at Hugo. Mm-hmm. And where that's at and stuff.
So Dream of Wild Health is a nonprofit farm, and it's located, what is it? 170th County Road 4, I think, that area. And the amazing part about it, because it started just that little tiny half-acre garden down by Farmington, that was leased from another farmer. And then they purchased the 10-acre farm in Hugo. And then in the past couple of years, they purchased another 20 acres across the road. So it is now a 30-acre farm doing this work of growing out these very old seeds, and then so that they can be returned as food for Native communities, primarily serving Native people in the Twin Cities, which, is a large community. There's about 38,000 Native people living in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But they also have the summer programs that bring Native youth up from the cities, put them in a van every day, drive them up to the farm. And then they would spend the day there, and they'd learn how to garden, they'd learn how to cook, they'd learn how to work at the farmer's market. They would get paid to do this. And, and we saw just an amazing transformation in these kids having this experience and learning more about their culture and who they are as Native people. And so to me, it's just an incredible organization. They do a farmer's market down in the Twin Cities in the Phillips neighborhood. They also offer a CSA, and you can look them up online, Dream of Wild Health.
Jim, I can send you some of that information. I found them. I just looked them up online, and they have a good website, so it's pretty accessible. That's fabulous. I didn't even know they existed, and they're right around the corner from us.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful program. That's super exciting. Somebody else had a question. Leah had a question. As a writer, do you have a strategy or special process you use when you're creating a character's development? Do you use outside help from friends or mentors?
Yes. And Leah, this makes me wonder, are you a writer? Are you working on something?
I'm not. I read a lot though.
Yeah. Okay. Because I have to say, character development is something that writers talk about a lot, and we swap tips about, because it is hard to make a believable character. So there are one of the exercises that I've used that is helpful is, it's like a sheet of facts. So the height, hair color, eye color, where do they live? What foods do they like? It's like you try to describe a real person, and then you have all of this factual information. But what I did for this book, which is why it ended up being 4 voices, was I was actually just trying to figure out more about, because originally this book was only going to be told from Rosalie. She was going to be the only voice. And then I was trying to figure out more about these other characters, though, Gabby and Darlene, and then also Marie. And so I developed this exercise where I would just open my notebook and I'd write the character's name at the top. And then I would write, tell me your story, I'm listening. And then I would just free write. And it would be this character's voice just came out. And what I discovered was that they had stories to tell, that by opening the book up to 4 voices, I could bring in different perspectives that would really round out the story, but also different time periods. So I kind of stumbled on that one, Leah, but it turned out to be really, really helpful in learning the voice and the story. Because I didn't, when I started out writing those pages, I didn't really know where they were going, which is a really interesting part of writing. And then using outside help, friends and mentors, yes, I've used writers groups. I have writer friends that we will swap manuscripts. I have certainly worked, this one I worked with what we call a developmental editor, and I just sent her the rough draft. And because I'd never written fiction before, so she helped give me a lot of good feedback to get the manuscript ready where I could send it to Milkweed. So yeah, I rely on, you're just too close to the material. So it's really helpful to have outside opinions.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, these are great questions.
Diane, have lived in Minnesota all my life, and I'm sorry to say that I had not heard of you before, but you might be interested to know that my brother, who lives in San Francisco, California, emailed me and he said, you have got to read this book. So consequently, because I appreciate, he really knows good books. So I called my library just this morning and I would have been 64th on the list, which should be kind of nice to hear in New Brighton, Minnesota. But anyway, I was wondering, since he knew about the book and I didn't, how do you promote it? What happens? How did it get out in California? And I never knew about it.
Zoom. So the great thing about working with Milkweed is they are a national publisher.
Oh, they are? Oh,
they are. Yeah. I mean, for Minnesota has fabulous publishers. We have just a tremendous literary community. Minnesota's known for its literary community. So when they publicize the book, they put it out on a national level. And then because we're still living in a Zoom world, it turns out that I can go anywhere. I've been to California.
Oh,
I've been on the East Coast.
With your book? You mean like with a book, whatever they call it? Yeah. Oh, well, that's maybe where he heard about you then.
Yeah. So there's, I actually did a couple of interviews with people out in California, and then, and some blogs with people out there. And then I think a reading with one of the bookstores. But that's the big gift of Zoom is that we can, as writers, go anywhere. I mean, it doesn't make up for the magic that happens when we're all in a room together. I get to feel the energy of the room, and then, and it's really nice to be with people that you can see. So, I missed that part. And there have been more in-person library events. At least there were this fall. This month it's pretty quiet, but except for Zoom. But yeah, that's how I got out to California. But that's a great story.
Yeah. I'm so glad that he mentioned it.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
And I'm so glad that the book, I think, has come out in a moment when people need stories that, even though there's a lot of hard history in here, it's intended to be a hopeful book. It's intended to help us get back into that relationship with plants and animals that helps us get through all the terrible stuff that we've gone through just in the past 2 years.
Yeah.
But it's nature that keeps us resilient.
Mm-hmm.
That's really true. Somebody was asking about more information about the farm in Hugo, and I'll send that information out to everybody. I have everybody's email, so I'll send that out to everybody. And then somebody else asked, Catherine again asked if, she says, it seems like we're coming into a renaissance of Indigenous writers. And how do you see your writing as moving our Minnesota culture? And I was really interested in your new project, The Voices Rising Native Women Writers. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about both of those things.
Yeah, and that anthology actually ties right into that question. And I have to say my work is really intentional about bringing forward history that really hasn't been taught very well in our schools in Minnesota. And so even like telling that, writing that memoir was a way of sharing a story that the history of boarding schools has been repressed for many, many years. And that is just now starting to get some more visibility and some of the attention that it so badly needs in order to know the true history of what happened through those boarding schools. And so that's a very intentional part of the work that I do, is to bring forward history, and in this book, history as a story, because certainly The Seed Keeper as a novel is based on a lot of true history around seeds, around gardening, around the 1862 Dakota War. And so that's why it has such a long afterword, because even though it's a novel, I want people to understand it really is substantially, factually true on many of the topics that I talk about. But the other part of that work is because for so long there haven't been many Indigenous writers. And so what happened was that then Native history, Native stories were being told by non-Native writers. And that's not how it should happen. But because I wasn't seeing, I would be asked to work on panels or judge writing contests, and I wasn't seeing Native writers as finalists or winners. So I worked with, I'm still working with All My Relations Gallery in Minneapolis, which is a Native organization and they are, so we formed a 8-person writing group for emerging writers. So these are people who hadn't published a book yet. And so for the past year and a half, I've been working with these writers to learn how, as a writing group. So I'm the mentor, and then they work on their projects. And then we learn about publishing and grant writing and editing and all these things. And then with the hope that then we're going to see new books coming out of that kind of process. But I agree that there is a lot more Native writers being published these days. And there's also so much great work happening in the food movement. So if some of you have heard about Sean Sherman and his restaurant downtown, which is fantastic. So, you know, it's hard to get in because it's so fantastic. But if you get the chance, it's just an incredible opportunity to really appreciate native foods, indigenous foods. So yeah, it's a good time this is a very hopeful time, I think, for change.
Well, thank you. And on that note, it's about 8 o'clock, and I've really appreciated your generosity with your time. And I want to thank you for coming and sharing your work with us. It's been a really great evening. Thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate everyone coming out tonight. It's been nice to share this evening with you.
Yes, thank you. And then I just want to put in a little plug for the other writers that will be in the rest of the series. So the next writers that we have will be Sun-Young Shun, and she will be speaking on January 20th. And I hope that you will consider registering for Sun-Young Shin's talk if you haven't already. So thank you again to Diane, and it's been wonderful. Have a good evening.
Yep.
Thank
you. Good night.
Good night.